Looking at the Vietnam War, we can see it from many perspectives. I want to focus on three perspectives. There's a lot more than that. First perspective is the global context of the Vietnam War. What was going on in the whole world at the time? It was a Cold War event. And really, the Vietnam War, as we know, was a proxy war. You had the Soviet Union, you had Communist China, you had their satellite states, Warsaw Pact, Cuba, and so forth. So on one side was this global communist force that was trying to take over small nations, gobble up little countries like Vietnam. On the other side was the U.S., Western Europe, NATO, Canada, the free world, so-called, throw in Australia, trying to stop communist takeover. So the global context is the international communist conspiracy trying to gobble up small countries versus the West with its values of freedom, democracy, liberty, yada, yada, yada. That's number one. Number two perspective is a domestic perspective, the internal politics of the United States at the time. What was going on between the time when the conflict in Vietnam began up to the time when the U.S. entered that conflict, up to the time when the U.S. got out of that conflict. What was going on with Presidents Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon? What was the man in the street, the average U.S. citizen, thinking and feeling about the Vietnam War? Very complicated, socially speaking. We end up with, as you know, massive riots and protests against the Vietnam War. We end up with a president losing his ability to be reelected. Lyndon Johnson knew that there was no way he could get reelected because of his unpopularity, which was due to the Vietnam War. So you can look at that war through the lens of domestic politics, what's going on inside the U.S. Third perspective is the military perspective, simply focusing on the tactics, the strategies. The U.S. had a large, well-trained, well-equipped ground army that was great for fighting a traditional war where there's a front, there's a line drawn on a map, we have one side, the enemy has the other, and you confront each other and you push the front one way or the other. The Vietnam War was guerrilla warfare. It was hit and run tactics. There was no front. You couldn't draw a line on a map and say, we have secured one side of the line and the enemy has secured the other side of the line. It just didn't work like that. So it was a very different type of military environment, required the development of new tactics and strategies. And so the U.S. got better and better at this kind of warfare the longer the war went on. Unfortunately, that didn't help the U.S. because in the end it turned out to be about the media, about the newspapers, TV, and radio, and the way they reported the war, rather than the fact that the U.S. was actually getting better and beginning to win the war. Also, in terms of military thinking, the Vietnam War developed some new ideas in terms of the use of helicopters. Helicopters had certainly already been used in Korea, but in Vietnam much more extensively, and the ways in which helicopters were used was something new. We're also going to see the development of things like Operation Ranch Hand. What was that? This was a military undertaking. Operation Ranch Hand involved flying over large areas of forests and distributing a chemical substance known as Agent Orange. Agent Orange is a defoliant. It caused all the trees and much of the other plants to drop their leaves. And suddenly you went from the middle of summer, it looked like winter because there were no leaves on the trees. Why? This enabled us to see the enemy better. Operation Ranch Hand was a new way of doing things, kind of experimental. Whether it was a success or a failure can be debated to this point in time. What is, however, clear is that it had unanticipated consequences. That's a phrase you're going to hear over and over again in history, unanticipated consequences. Long after the Vietnam War is over, long after everybody has more or less forgotten about Agent Orange and Operation Ranch Hand, it will turn out that many of the soldiers who were part of that operation developed serious health problems because they were exposed to these chemicals. So that's another part of the story of the military angle on Vietnam. So three perspectives: the global perspective, the national perspective, and the military perspective on the Vietnam War. We're going to take a look at the Vietnam War, a complicated and sad story. At the end of World War II, the Japanese had occupied all of this. At the end of the war, the Japanese have to leave. Vietnam is also known as French Indochina. This was a territory belonging to France at the end of World War II, 1945. About 9 years later, in 1954, the Vietnamese are going to stage a rebellion and demand independence from France. France, still tired from World War II, does not have the energy or the resources to begin defending its territory, so France says, fine, you can have it, and Vietnam becomes an independent country. However, almost immediately it splits into North Vietnam and South Vietnam. North Vietnam is controlled by Soviet and Chinese dictatorship. The leader, a guy named Ho Chi Minh, is going to be the famous figure controlling North Vietnam. South Vietnam is a country that is supported by the United States, United Nations, and some of the Western allies, and is going to have a more or less freely elected government of representatives. So the classic Cold War setup, very similar to Korea, very similar to East and West Germany, a split country. There is fighting between the two almost from the beginning, 1954. However, the amount of fighting at first is relatively small, a few guerrilla strikes. The fighting will escalate over the years. The Americans under President Eisenhower, the United States is going to say, we don't want to be involved in this war. We're not going to send soldiers there to be part of this war. President Eisenhower in the late 1950s says, we'll give you some advice, we'll give you some military training, but we're not going to send our soldiers to fight in this war. So President Eisenhower kept us out of the Vietnam War. However, in January 1961, President Kennedy, he becomes president, and he is going to begin escalating the U.S. involvement in the war. So President Kennedy is going to send more soldiers to Vietnam. President Kennedy dies in November of 1963. The next president is Lyndon Johnson. President Johnson will send even more soldiers. So President Johnson is going to be the guy who carries out the biggest part of the Vietnam War. He's the centerpiece, if you will, and for that reason, many Americans were not happy with President Johnson. By the time the Vietnam War was at its peak, we had more than 500,000 soldiers in Vietnam. South Vietnam, here's the borderline, North Vietnam. The problem with this war is it was not fought like a traditional war where there's a front where you can say here's a line and one side over there and the other side on this side of the line. There was no clear front. Instead, there were hit-and-run guerrilla activities all over the place. Made it very difficult because Americans were not used to fighting that kind of war. In addition, we're going to see that there are other countries that border Vietnam. We have Cambodia here, we have Laos here, and the North Vietnamese are sending their guerrilla soldiers, their terrorists, through these other countries. So then to stop that, the South Vietnamese, the United States, some other United Nations countries want to be in Cambodia and in Laos to prevent the soldiers from coming through. But Laos and Cambodia are not happy with that. They say, hey, we aren't part of this war. We're neutral countries. And so the war gets more and more complicated and more controversial as U.S. soldiers begin operating in Cambodia and in Laos. So it's an ugly situation. By 1970 or so, we're going to see that the U.S. is beginning to adapt, beginning to take advantage of the situation, and is on its way to victory. However, at the very time when the U.S. and South Vietnam could have won the war, the media coverage of the war is going to turn the public against it. A big event, 1968, was the Tet Offensive. The Tet Offensive was a military victory for the United States and for South Vietnam. North Vietnam lost the Tet Offensive. However, the way it was presented in the newspapers, on television, on the radio, made it seem like a terrible loss for the United States. And so the media turned the American public against the war to a large extent. President Richard Nixon is going to take over from Lyndon Johnson, and Nixon was elected in November of '68, and one of Nixon's goals, one of the things he campaigned on, was, I will get us out of the Vietnam War. Well, sure enough, Richard Nixon is going to start doing that. Richard Nixon is elected in November of '68, takes office in January of '69, and by 1973, the United States is withdrawing its soldiers from Vietnam. So January '73, U.S. soldiers, U.S. military no longer part of the Vietnam War, no longer present in this area. Well, unfortunately, the North still had its supporters. It still had the Soviet Union and China. So it had two great big nations backing it, whereas South Vietnam had lost the big nation that was backing it. It had lost support from the United States. So the North will quickly crush the South. At the same time, we're going to see Laos and Cambodia being under the thumb of brutal communist dictatorships. So what's going to happen in the wake of the Vietnam War is Vietnam becomes one, North and South Vietnam join to form one Vietnam. There's Laos, there's Cambodia, and all three of these countries are going to experience massive human rights violations. People are murdered, people are tortured, people are sold into slavery because it's under the influence of the Soviet Union, Communist China, and because the United States is no longer in the region. So Vietnam, a tragic story. These nations, millions of innocent people turned over to live sad and difficult lives under communist dictatorships, and that is the sad outcome of the Vietnam War. Going back to the start of the Vietnam War, then, over a long history, we can see that the roots of the war lie in a phenomena of post-colonial weakness. What does that mean? That means when colonies, when small nations which had been part of someone else's empire, when they get their freedom, right? That's a good thing. You want to be independent. You want to get your freedom, your liberty. But when they get it, they go through a very vulnerable stage because they are brand new nations. They're like little babies. They're like little baby chicks or baby animals. They're vulnerable. They're fragile. And so the first few years after a nation gets independence, it's vulnerable, and that's what happened to Vietnam. It belonged to France. Vietnam was part of the French Empire. It got its independence, it got its freedom, and what happened, the international communist conspiracy looked at Vietnam and said, this is a brand new nation. It's really young, it's really weak, it's really vulnerable. We can take it over. So whenever you see a new nation, right? A post-colonial nation, somebody who's just gotten their freedom, just gotten their independence. This is the time when they are likely to be targeted by the international communist conspiracy, right? The Soviet Union, Red China, mainland China are going to come after it because they know it hasn't gotten itself fully organized. It's not yet mature enough to defend itself. So this pattern has been repeated over and over. Vietnam is just one example. We can see this in Africa. We can see this in other parts of Southeast Asia. It's even been attempted in Central and South America, this communist aggression towards brand new nations. Another aspect is the media aspect in the domestic scene of U.S. politics. It is clear that this was an effort by the media during the war to turn the public against the war, to portray the U.S. as incompetent and immoral. So this is very different than previous wars, the Korean War, World War II. Media had more or less tried to report the facts. During the Vietnam War, the media gave up the pretense of simply relaying the facts of the war and took an active role in turning American society against the war. And how do we know this? What's the evidence for this? The evidence is the fact that the U.S. military was becoming more and more effective against North Vietnam, against the Viet Cong. The U.S. was becoming more successful militarily at the same time that the U.S. media was portraying the U.S. as losing. So they were headed in opposite directions. The media portrayal was a big part of what brought down Lyndon Johnson and what turned the U.S. public against the war. Another aspect in terms of domestic politics in the U.S., the social acceptance of soldiers who had fought in Vietnam. And this was a very painful thing. Many of these individuals went to Vietnam as part of the U.S. military. Many of them were drafted. They had no choice. They had to go. Others volunteered, not necessarily because they fully understood or even agreed with U.S. policy in Vietnam and what the larger situation was there. They were simply trying to help their country. And they were not to blame for what was going on in Vietnam. That blame lied with President Kennedy and President Johnson and their administrations. And yet the anger of the public was often taken out on these individuals who were at the lowest level of military influence, and yet they bore the brunt of the consequences. They bore the anger of many Americans, which is truly a shame on several levels. The final sort of takeaway from this is there was perhaps a good-hearted effort to stop the communist takeover in Vietnam. That would have been a good thing if we could have prevented the fall of Vietnam to the communists. However, in the long run, it didn't happen. And to this day, there's a lot of debate. You can read many, many good books about the Vietnam War. You could also read quite a few bad books about the Vietnam War. You'll see many different opinions, and I will leave it to you to do further research on your own and learn about the Vietnam War. Bye-bye.